All right, so it is noon, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Eureka Williams, and I'm an associate professor of English here at TCC's Metro Campus, and we'd like to welcome you all to Afternoons of African American Awareness. This event is sponsored by the African American Student Association and Student Life. Today, we are very honored to have with us Dr. Karlos Hill from the University of Oklahoma in Norman. Please note that this event is being recorded. Also, mute yourselves until the end if you have a question or comment. And to introduce Dr. Hill, we have Tanya Crutcher, who's the treasurer of the African American Student Association. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Williams, for that introduction. Dr. Karlos Hill is the Associate Professor of the African and African American Studies at the University of Oklahoma and the founding director of the Distinguished African American History Month lecture series at the university. Dr. Hill specializes in the history of lynching and the anti-lynching movement in America. His core research aim is to uncover the various ways in which racial violence has been central to the Black experiences in America. Additionally, Dr. Hill's research explores how Black Americans have resisted racial violence and how Black resistance has changed over time. Dr. Hill is a frequent commentator on issues of race, equity, and social justice. He has been quoted in the USA Today, Newswise, and the Dallas Morning News, Texas Public Radio, and numerous times in local and regional news outlets. His weekly podcast, Tapestry, a conversation about race and culture, has a global following. Everyone, please help me welcome Dr. Karlos K. Hill. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Tanya, for that wonderful, gracious introduction. And thank you, Dr. Williams, for inviting me to share my work, my witness with you and your students and as well as members of the community, Tulsa Community College. I really, really appreciate the opportunity. And to everyone else, good afternoon. Really, really excited to be here. And anytime that I can, support a Tulsa-based institution around the Race Massacre, I jump at it. So I appreciate the invitation. And so I'm going to try to share my screen because I do have a PowerPoint presentation. And the reason for that, I don't like PowerPoint, but the reason for it is I want to share with you some images of the Race Massacre that's based in the research that I've done, but also the book that I've just completed and will be published in March of 2021. And so I have a PowerPoint presentation. I'll share that with you, but I want to just go ahead and see if the PowerPoint will work. So give me 1 second to try to manipulate the screen here. And then see if it can work. Can everyone see that? Okay, perfect. Thank you. So as Tanya mentioned, Dr. Karlos K. Hill, Associate Professor and Chair of the Clara Department of African and African American Studies at the University of Oklahoma. And, I'm a historian by training, but a Black Studies scholar in practice. And not only that, I'm a community engaged scholar, teacher, who's really, committed to not just interrogating difficult racial histories, but also their present day implications with the goal of trying to create a more just and equitable world, particularly for Black people, but for all people. I just to put a fine point on this, part of what motivates me is making sure I'm in service to others, and not just in service to others, in service to community. And a quote from Dr. King really encapsulates that. Dr. King was fond of saying, life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are we doing for others? What are you doing for others? And I've tried to take that message, that prompting to heart, because I truly believe, as Dr. King believed, the fate of our country, the fate of our world rests on how we as individuals, how we as communities, how we as institutions, right, respond to that prompt. What are you doing for others? And so that drives my research. That drives all the writing that I do. How can this be of service to the community? How can this be of service to community initiatives, community struggles? And so that drives my work, and that's certainly driven my work on the Race Massacre. And so what I want to do is just kind of talk to you about some of the research and scholarship that I have done over the last 3 years or so on the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. And I should say that this isn't research for me. When I started the process, it was research. I really believe now it's shifted, and it's about my identity. Like, I've come to identify with Black Tulsans, the Greenwood district. And, I don't talk about this issue anymore as an objective historian. I don't think I ever did, but certainly now I'm a partisan, and I am fighting for justice for the community. And so all the work that I've been doing has been about trying to lift up certain aspects of the Race Massacre to help hopefully push forward the conversation about reparations, to push forward the conversation about reconciliation, to push forward the various ways that the city and the state need to make amends for what occurred. And so I am no partisan on this, on Greenwood, Race Massacre. I certainly understand the stakes and that things need to change. And so I speak from that place, not from a place of trying to be an objective, distant academic or scholar. And so I'm going to talk to you about that research. And, just in short, though, I would say that for me, the Race Massacre is the deadliest. And if not the deadliest, certainly one of the deadliest outbreaks of anti-Black violence in American history. There's no way around it, right? This is what the Race Massacre represents. And for many years, historians as well as lay people talked about the race riot as the largest civil disturbance in America after the Civil War, right? And so between 1921 and 1965, what occurred in Tulsa as the largest civil disturbance in American history. For me, I think about it not on those terms. I think about it really as the darkest chapter in Oklahoma history, and perhaps our nation's history, because of the level of cruelty and viciousness that was on display for 12 to 15 hours, May 31st and June 1st, 1921. And so the question that I really want us to think about, and this is something that I've given a lot of thought to over the last 3 years, is what's at stake in talking about the events of 1921 as a massacre? Why does it matter that we talk about it, what occurred, as a massacre versus a race riot? What's at stake, and why should we care? And I think there are huge stakes involved, and there's some really specific reasons around why we should care that have something to do with the 100th anniversary of the massacre, but in some ways has little to do with that. And so, my goal today is to talk through with you why massacre, and talking about it and framing it as a massacre, is so important in this moment. I tend to talk about, before I jump into the history, I tend to talk about my work on the Centennial Commission around teacher training, teacher education. But because I really just want to jump in the conversation, I will, I'm certainly happy to take any questions about that in the Q&A, but I kind of just want to jump into the history. And so what I want to do is read a few paragraphs from some of the research that I've done over the last couple of years on the Race Massacre. And I just want to read a couple of paragraphs, not anything too long, but I just want to give you my sort of historical contextualization without feeling like I need to just, spend the whole hour walking you through a history of the Race Massacre that I know you're familiar with. And so I will read a few paragraphs from some research that I've done in the last 3 years. And then what I really want to do is spend the bulk of our time really meditating on and reflecting on some of the photographs that I've been able to, that are included in my forthcoming book to help visualize why talking about this as a massacre is absolutely necessary right now. And so I'll read, and then I'll share some photos, and then hopefully we can pause for some questions, whatever questions are germinating at that point. We can pause for those questions after we look at those images, and then we can either continue to sort of talk, I can digest and respond to those questions, or I can provide more sort of background and context on the photos, depending on where people's energy is at that point. And so I'll start with just reading these few paragraphs. The 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre is the deadliest outbreak of white terrorist violence against a Black community in American history. In 1921, Tulsa's Greenwood district, or Black Wall Street as it was known affectionately, was one of the wealthiest Black communities in the United States. Yet during the evening of May 31st and the early morning hours of June 1, 1921, Tulsa exploded. Enraged by rumors that a Black man, Dick Rowland, had attempted to sexually assault a white girl, Sarah Page, a white mob invaded the Greenwood district. And we know this from survivor accounts. The whites who invaded the Greenwood district indiscriminately killed any Black person they encountered. It is estimated that more than 300 people, mostly Black people, died due to the violence. Some Black Tulsans fled for safety as the violence was unfolding, while others banded together to defend their lives and their property. In the end, though, despite the fact that the resistance that was offered as a point of pride for survivors and their descendants, in the end, Black resistance was futile. The white mob, aided by white authorities that included police, as well as the National Guard, looted and then set ablaze to practically every home and business in the district. All told, in less than 24 hours, the 35-block area that constituted the Greenwood district, which included more than a dozen churches, 5 hotels, 31 restaurants, 4 drugstores, 8 doctor's offices, 24 grocery stores, public library, and more than 1,000 homes in less than 24 hours was gone, lie in ruin. And so the scale of the destruction and the loss of life that was unleashed upon Tulsa's Black community was unprecedented. And we need to really understand that. It is really unprecedented. And so it's unprecedented, but it's not exceptional. Over the course of American history, there have been more than 250 episodes of collective white violence against Black communities. And these are just instances that we know about that have been documented. There are likely many more that went undocumented. For example, just 2 years prior to the Tulsa Race Massacre, white terrorist violence against Black communities in Oklahoma occurred, particularly in Dewey, Oklahoma. And in Dewey, Oklahoma, similar to Tulsa, a white mob burned down the quote unquote Negro district. And they successfully, unlike in Tulsa, they successfully drove out of Dewey 20 Black families. In response to the allegations that a Black man had murdered a white police officer. So the Black community of Dewey was violently expelled, right, from that town just a few years before what occurred in Tulsa. And so what occurred, the scale was unprecedented, but the event itself was not exceptional. And so as with the white terrorist violence that occurred in Dewey, Oklahoma, right, the Tulsa Race Massacre was not simply about destroying Black businesses. It wasn't simply about terrorizing Black people. I contend, and certainly in the book I contend, that what was really occurring was an attempted community expulsion. The violence was about terrorizing Black people, Black Greenwood residents, to such a degree that they would leave the city in mass. And when it was clear that Black Tulsans were intent on rebuilding the Greenwood district, white city leaders attempted to block rebuilding through a proposed rezoning ordinance. And so what we know is that Black Tulsans who remained were adamant that they would rebuild. And what happened after the city proposed the rezoning ordinance and it was passed, Black Tulsans led by B.C. Franklin successfully was able to force, well, not even force, but to make a successful argument for why the zoning ordinance should not be allowed to stand. And so because of the work of B.C. Franklin and others, right, that rezoning ordinance, there was a permanent injunction placed by a local district judge that paved the way for Black Tulsans to ultimately rebuild. Now, what we need to understand about the rebuilding is that even though damages to homes, to businesses, and the loss of property amounted to somewhere between $2.5 million and $4 million. And we still don't know, because at the time a forensic audit of the destruction did not occur. We still don't truly know how much Black wealth was liquidated in those 12 to 15 hours. But our best estimates are between $2.5 and $4 million in 1921 dollars. And so the reason why this is really important is local insurance companies denied every claim, literally every claim submitted by Black Greenwood business owners and residents. And to make matters worse, Tulsa city leaders refused external financial assistance. Right? They took this posture that Tulsa did this to itself, Tulsa will fix it itself, but then they didn't. The financial burden for rebuilding rested squarely and solely on Black residents. And so external financial assistance from other towns and cities in Oklahoma or across the nation could have helped fill that financial void created by the unpaid insurance claims. But that, of course, didn't happen. And so what I try to really emphasize is when we step back and we look at the whole sweep of the history, the actions of the white mob, the actions of city leaders, it's clear to me that in retrospect, what was being attempted was an effort to banish Tulsa's Black community, as had happened in cities in Arkansas in this period, as well as in towns in Oklahoma. And so if it were not for the efforts of Black Tulsans to rebuild their community in the face of white intransigence, there would be no Greenwood today, right? And so Greenwood being there today, right, is a testament to their courage, it's a testament to their resilience. And that, I think, we need to be squarely kind of focused on that, right? As the centennial approaches, that we are only talking about 100th anniversary because of survivors, right? And their courage and resilience in the face of white intransigence. And so I want to kind of step back, because I know I've said a lot, even though even though there's much more to say. I just want to step back, and I want for us to kind of shift a little bit. And what I really want to focus on at this moment is bringing the violence, bringing the destruction into clear focus. And so one of the things that I discovered or began to discover, when I started the book project, and this is, I'm someone who spent a lot of time researching, writing about lynching photographs. What struck me about Tulsa, and particularly the Race Massacre, is the number of photos that existed 100 years later. The number of photos that have been archived in museums and research libraries around the country was shocking, right? There were nearly 5,000 lynchings that we know about, documented lynchings that we know about. And we only have about 100 images, right, of lynching victims. Mind you that not in every lynching there were photographs taken, but in many of them there were. We have about 100 or so, 150 or so images of lynchings that really help us to understand lynching culture. For the Race Massacre, I was able to identify at least 500 images, right, connected to the Race Massacre to produce the photographic history. I can't think of another instance of anti-Black violence that has as many images. I certainly have not come across them, if there are more. And so I truly believe, and I haven't been able to definitively prove this, but I do believe that the Race Massacre is the most photographed instance of anti-Black violence in American history. And so in the book, I tried to capture as many photographs as my publisher would let me. I started out with 100. It ended up being nearer to 200 photographs that made it into the book. And so for me, the main thing that I was after was making sure that I could provide visual proof, visual evidence that what occurred was a massacre. And at the same time, and I'm doing that to help further the push for reparations within Tulsa, right? To make an undisputable argument that this was a massacre, and hopefully in doing so support efforts of activists in the city, as well as the legal team's push to get reparations for victims, survivors, and their descendants. And so what we kind of need to understand about the photographs is that most of them were taken by whites. But nonetheless, the photos help us to understand the Black experience of the massacre. And in order to really make sure that the photos help tell the story of what occurred to victims and survivors, I included alongside many of the photographs remembrances, excerpts from oral histories that contain the perspectives, the vantage point of survivors. And so I wanted to make sure that the images were narrated by survivors, and so that their understanding of what occurred was at the center of us dealing with the photographs, confronting even the photographs. And so I want to share with you some of the images, some of the most powerful images, I will say, from June 9, and most of the images are taken June 1, 1921. I want to share with you some of the most powerful ones, but admittedly, the photos contain scenes of violence, death, and destruction. And to be very honest, I tend not to show images unless I have a lot of time to unpack them. But because I know I'm coming to you as an audience who's knowledgeable about this history, I can, I feel somewhat comfortable sort of, deviating from my kind of standard approach. And so I'm not gonna narrate over these images. I will save that for the Q&A. But what I want each of you to do is to sort of carefully, so we're gonna kind of slowly go through them. I want you to be thinking about how these images make a case for what occurred being a massacre. And so I want you to be thinking about that as we are, we kind of slowly working through. And then once we've kind of gotten to the images, I want to pause for reflections and questions. And so I will just share with you the first image. And so thank you for kind of very slowly, methodically working through those photographs with me. Um, I'm deeply aware of how traumatic looking at photos such as this are. And even while the slideshow was playing, I found myself, tearing up because I know what the photos represent, extreme suffering. And so uh, I understand if some of you need to take a pause or take a break, we can do that. But I also know that there are some of you who are ready and willing to engage. And so I really want to just pause for questions, observations at this point, and then we can kind of move forward. If there are any.
So, Dr. Hill, there was
Yes.
one statement that you made that just really resonated with me that I hadn't thought about or heard in the way you mentioned it. You talked about the number of photographs of this incident and in comparison to the total volume within the country. And that just really is a striking piece of data that can't go unnoticed, unexplored, to just ask, and that the pictures were taken not by African Americans, but by white individuals. And for whatever reason, just to collect it as this is what happened, the shock, the documentation of it, whatever the reason it was, that we have this many pictures of this incident that many people today still say did not happen or say was a conspiracy is just, it's astounding and makes you want to pause just with that one piece of data there. And your book, which I've already just now went in and pre-ordered, your book is going to be a great documentation and a way of just delving into that piece of data.
Thank you. I appreciate the support, especially coming from you. What we have to realize is that what was on display in Tulsa, May 31st and June 1 was not just white racism or white resentment, it was lynching culture. What occurred was a product of lynching culture. And lynching culture, to a certain degree, revolved around photography. It is how white supremacy, lynching photographs, is how white supremacy was disseminated in the early 20th century. And so when whites invaded Greenwood, and there were waves of whites coming into the community, right? They're not just coming with guns, right? They're coming with cameras as well. And whites are taking pictures of every aspect of what's occurring, with some notable exceptions, right? The whites who died as a result of the violence, no pictures of that. Whites burning and looting, no pictures of that. But the destruction and the loss of life for Black Americans, documented. And particularly, both professional as well as amateur white photographers, and then just ordinary regular people, were really keen to try to capture the violence from up on high. So there are photographs of whites who taken from tall buildings in Tulsa to help people to understand the scope of the destruction. We should also understand that these photographs aren't being created to document what occurred. They are being, because this is lynching culture. This is about demonstrating how white people had put down a attempted Negro rebellion. And so whites who were taking pictures were trying to share with friends, families, and other people their role, their participation in putting down this quote unquote Negro rebellion. And so these photographs that for many years, right, were hidden away in attics. You couldn't get any of these photographs 40 years ago anywhere in Tulsa, right? But slowly over time, and particularly because of the work of the first commission, right, in the 1990s or the 2000s, these photographs began to surface. And slowly, after the 2000s, white families began to donate their collection of photographs, or just a photograph that they might have or was given to them, to the University of Tulsa, to the Tulsa Historical Society, to the Oklahoma Historical Society, so that now, right, just at the university, or excuse me, the Tulsa Historical Society, there are over 300 photographs. At the University of Tulsa, nearly as many. Oklahoma Historical Society, same thing. And so these were photographs that were meant to document putting down a Negro, quote unquote, Negro rebellion. And so this is a part of lynching culture, right? And we just need to understand it. And your question really helped me to try to bring that out. So thank you, Dwayne.
There was a question about the black men who are raising their hands by Professor Givens. She's asking if you have any information of what happened to them.
Can you say that one more? I don't think I got
the black men who are captured, who are raising, working with raised hands. What do you know? What happened to them?
So part of what's really frustrating for me is, in so few of the photographs, we can name who's actually in them, right? Their identities and what ultimately happened to them, right? What really sits with me and haunts me is the not knowing the names, the identities of the Black victims, the deceased Black victims that are captured in the photographs, and not knowing who they were. Were their bodies dumped in a mass grave? Were families able to identify them and quickly kind of before being interned themselves, identify a family member so that they weren't just dumped in a mass grave? Those are the things that really gnaw at me. And so we don't know the identities of either the deceased victims or the men who are the photograph of them, being marched through. We think that photograph was taken South Main, downtown, and we don't know the identities of who's in the photograph and ultimately what happened to them. But what was about to occur in the photographs was, we believed that those men were being either marched to the convention hall or to McNulty Park or to the fairgrounds, where they would be detained upwards of 2 weeks, right? For some, they were detained until a white person, particularly a white employer, would come to one of these detention centers, detention camps even, and vouch for them, to vouch for who they were, and that they were gainfully employed before they would be released. And upon release, being released, Black Tulsans had to carry around with them an identification card. And if they were found without that identification card, they could be subject to violence, arrest, or whatever the officer that encountered them felt was necessary. And so what we have to understand is that, after 15 hours, there are 10,000 Black people in Tulsa that are homeless because they have no home to go to. And so we know that people were homeless, people had very little food or any supplies, medical supplies to deal with what had just occurred, what had just happened to them. And if it were not for the American Red Cross, the number of people who actually died would have been much higher. But because of their medical assistance as well as humanitarian assistance in the days following, because the city was completely in disarray, there would have been many more deaths, unnecessary deaths connected to what occurred, the violence that occurred.
Dr. Hill, we do have a question from one of our students. Tanya, if you want to go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Williams. Dr. Hill, looking at your photographs I'm getting choked up. It's very, very shocking. I have seen a lot of the photographs that are displayed in your book. Some of them I have not. My question is in regards to your thoughts on the discussion of reparations. My children are actually descendants of a Tulsa Race Massacre survivor. My late husband's great-grandmother's family owned a restaurant on Greenwood. Once that was destroyed, they left the community for some time and came back. But of course, their business was not rebuilt. And seeing the negative feedback from the city of Tulsa and more specifically from Mayor Bynum in the discussion of reparations, the negative feedback as far as, why should money be given and how do you distinguish who it should be given to, is disappointing to me because I kind of feel like my children have been cheated out of family inheritance that could have been passed on, specifically family wealth that could have been passed down. Looking at your pictures, it's obvious that there was, physical destruction of homes and businesses. What are your thoughts on the discussion about that?
I mean, it's what's happening in Tulsa is what has happened in America for decades in terms of the discourse around reparations. For me, it's very simple. The people and institutions responsible for what occurred need to be held accountable. And reparations is about holding the individuals and the institutions responsible accountable. What we have in American society, and we've always had in American society, is a system in which white people get reparations, but everyone else need not apply. The only individuals who have received reparations for slavery were slaveholders. The only individuals who received reparations for the Race Massacre, for lynching, were Italian Americans, right? Who the Italian government, who the United States wanted to continue to court and to have peaceable relations with, decided it was in their best interest as the government to provide reparations for 4 Italians being murdered in New Orleans in 1891. So white people have been the only individuals who've received reparations for lynching. For Tulsa, the same. There are a handful of white businesses and munition stores, gun stores that were looted that received reparations from the city. Black survivors, Black business owners never received. And so we've created a situation in the society where we reparations have only been received when there have been white victims. When there have been Black victims or victims of color, you know, it's too hard to figure out who deserves what. Too much time has elapsed, and therefore it doesn't make sense to punish people today for the sins of yesteryear or for the sins of others. And so there's always been these arguments manufactured when it comes to people of color, but have never been used to deny white Americans reparations. I don't know this to be true, but I would even assume with the Oklahoma City bombing, whites who were harmed by that received reparations, right? I don't know that to be true, but I'm willing to bet if you started to look into payments made, right, for injuries suffered, for psychological, for all of this, reparations were paid, right? And so what we have to get beyond is the segregation of reparations just being for white people, right? Because in America, when it comes to white grievances, reparations is a moral principle, right? When it comes to violence against Black people, it becomes the issue of, well, it's not the right time, or well, that's so many years ago, or well, how do we even figure out what people deserve? Like it becomes, it's not about the principle, it's about the practicality of, or the lack thereof. And so part of what we have to do is move beyond that and really reckon with, right, the suffering and the need to atone for that suffering, right, whether it's white or Black people who experience it. And so Tulsa in many ways is no different from what's occurred in America, but I think in Tulsa there's so much defensiveness about the massacre that it's creating a lot of unnecessary just a lot of unnecessary friction, right? And so I think you're spot on, and I'm hoping that the centennial and the goodwill that I am witnessing on a daily basis that there is will be enough to push this forward. But I know it's also going to take activists demanding, not allowing the city and the state to rest with these sort of arguments about why repair, it's too late for repair.
So, Dr. Hill, I want to just make one more statement there. I find your argument to be one of the most compelling I've actually heard. Not that reparations are something to argue about, but the way you framed it as a comparison of other cases where, again, we'd have to look at the Oklahoma City bombing to see what has happened, or the trade towers, which was certainly larger, many groups of people in New York. But it wasn't that we could ever pay anyone for the full extent of the family's loss. But there were immediate reactions of setting aside funds to at least address a healing, a starting of, we want to make sure that families have something placed to help them. because there's an immediate recognition of a loss. So I think this is, you made some excellent points that that the comparison is there, that there's always this hesitation that goes with race, that goes particularly with those from an African American race, that needs to be addressed.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a double standard, and it's hypocrisy, and I think, you know, even though, you know, we may never get reparations from survivors, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue to hold up the double standard, to hold up the hypocrisy. Um, you know, that has been how this country has dealt with restorative justice. Restorative justice is great when white people are harmed, and not so great when people of color and Black people are harmed. And part of what we have to do, you know, as the 100th anniversary is coming, is make sure that that doesn't get lost. Like, that needs to be at the center of our conversation, because this commemoration can't be this comforting thing for people. It really needs to unsettle people, and it really needs to push us, in unsettling people, push forward the struggle, for not just reparations. I mean, there's a number of things at stake here, but certainly if we're going to center survivors, if we're going to center this and their descendants, then the reparations discussion has to be at the forefront.
I had just a comment when you talked about the photographs being used to document, by, the people who are kind of doing the destruction. Again, very kind of targeted to show just the Black destruction, nothing showing what the white individuals did. It just kind of, my mind went back to the insurrectionists a few weeks ago, and it's like they were there to document some, for them, so it's something that they were doing something right, I guess. But my mind just wandered to the insurrection.
No worries. Yeah, no, I don't get me started on the insurrection or Capitol riot. I could go off on that, but I think and this is the last thing I'll say about reparations. There's this idea that reparations is about a paycheck, right? Black people getting a paycheck or a check. Or there's this idea that, when reparations is this kind of event, it's going to happen, and we're going to move forward. And what we need to understand, that reparations is a process, and it's a process that is about remaking and transforming society. Some of the most compelling arguments for reparations for me is about trying to address the wealth gap between Blacks and whites, right? Black people, even though we represent about 13% of the nation's population, only about 2% of the nation's wealth. That wealth gap is there because of white racism, white supremacy, but specifically slavery, the super exploitation of Black labor that was never paid back, the countless number of instances of racial violence where Black wealth was liquidated, simply just destroyed, like as in Tulsa. Reparations is about trying to address that wealth gap, that huge barrier to Black progress. And so for me, we have to move beyond thinking about it as an event, as something that we're going to arrive at, and more see it as a process that will unfold over time. And this process is going to not just atone for the past. It's going to actually help us to remake and transform society today. And so people get so hung up on, you're going to increase my taxes, this is going to harm me, and they don't realize that this is about creating something new, transforming something that is. And so at least that's my vision for what we're talking about, in America, but specifically in Tulsa, right, in relation to reparations.
Dr. Hill, I first heard of you when we adopted Tulsa 1921 as our common book here at TCC. So for a moment, if you could just share with us how you got involved in writing the foreword for that book, and perhaps maybe your experience with it, if you want to, share some comments on that.
Sure. So I came to Oklahoma in the fall of 2016 to join the Clara Department of African American Studies at OU. And so a big part of me coming to Oklahoma was I want to really be a part of a community engaged department. I really wanted to be a part of a Black Studies department because I had been in a history department at Texas Tech before coming to Oklahoma. And so as soon as I arrived to Oklahoma, one of the first things that I did was attend the I think I'm trying to remember exactly now the event. I believe it was the sort of public wake for Terrence Crutcher. And I was so moved by Reverend Al Sharpton. I was so moved by Tiffany Crutcher and how powerfully they spoke, not just about the case at hand, but just about the need for change, that I think immediately thereafter, I made a beeline to the Greenwood district to try to understand what was going on in Tulsa. And I was struck by just how much pride there was in the community. I was struck by how even, how the history of the Race Massacre was documented. Was it, first of all, acknowledged, but also documented within the community? Because I can tell you, having studied many communities that had suffered lynching or racial violence similar to Tulsa, it's not documented, right? And so we think that people don't know about Tulsa. Think about the countless other instances where, the community has no idea their history of lynching and racial violence. And so Tulsa is, even though there could be a better job, right, in the state about teaching people about it, I think Greenwood is an outlier in terms of how visible this history is. And so I was struck by that. I was struck by the pride and how front and center this history was, and in some ways how much of a live wire it was. And so I began to try to figure out, I immediately started to figure, how can I be involved with this? How can I support various community organizations? That began my relationship with the Centennial Commission. And through that work on the commission, became a more sort of a visible supporter, proponent of reconciliation as well as reparations. And through that, OU Press contacted me because I'm at OU, so OU Press contacted me to say, hey, can you? And I'm also a historian of lynching and racial violence, so they were like, there's this great book that we're considering. Can you please be one of the reviewers for it? I said, of course, yes. But got really involved in the book beyond being a reviewer. And, I really wanted to make sure if I was going to put my, name on the book, it was going to represent me. And so I got more involved than I typically would in the book, and that ended up with me writing a foreword for it. But I can say for sure that Randy's book is, the freshest and perhaps the best telling from start to finish of what occurred. The details and the nuance that he's able to get into, pretty powerful. And you can see all his powers as a journalist come to the fore in how he teases out things from news sources. And, you can just tell for a decade, he had spent time, just canvassing all the various archives and research in the area to bring forward this portrait. And so I was moved by that, but wanted to make sure that the book ultimately talked about what occurred as a massacre, right? And the reason for that is, for me, if the centennial is going to be about anything, it's going to be about 100 years later, making sure we understand what occurred from the vantage point of victims and survivors and their descendants. At minimum, we can do that. At minimum, we can remember this history. We can tell the story of this history from their vantage point, whether or not reparations ever come. We can at least do that. And if we do that, that in and of itself would be a kind of validation of what those individuals went through. Because for too long, nearly 80 years after the event, it was still seen as a Negro rebellion. It was seen as these Black men who came downtown, brought the death and destruction upon the community. For too long, those narratives have sort of framed how white Oklahomans have thought about this. And so if we're going to make the 100th anniversary meaningful, let's tell this story for once from the vantage point of victims and survivors. We can at least do that. That's free, isn't it? There's no financial transaction that has to take place to do that. We can at least do that. But there's tremendous resistance to doing that. So, that's kind of where we are, on this. But I'm certainly going to be fighting for that, and, have tried to contribute to that cause through writing the book.
Everyone, we are a little over time, but does anyone have a burning comment or question for Dr. Hill while we still have him here for a little bit? Just something that you really want to ask, or just something that you'd like to share? Anyone?
I've probably exhausted you guys.
No, this has been great. This has been great.
Okay.
So I'll go ahead and conclude this session by saying, Dr. Hill, we are really humbled by your participation with us this afternoon. The last part of the series, the awareness part, you really honed in on that with us this afternoon. We are certainly more aware of what occurred right here around us. Many of us on this call work downtown. My office is downtown, just literally blocks from where all of this took place. If it weren't for social distancing restrictions and the pandemic and all of that, my students would have really engaged with that this year. But of course we couldn't do it. We will do it at some point, but we couldn't do it this time. But really, from the bottom of our hearts, thank you so much for your work with this and giving us your time this afternoon.